to present on the topic text-dependent questions. Dr. Frey is a professor of literacy in the School of Teacher Education at San Diego State University. She is also a classroom teacher at Health and Science High and Middle College. Dr. Frey is the recipient of an Early Career Achievement Award from the National Reading Conference and a co-recipient of the Krista McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teacher Education from the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Nancy has co-authored many professional books and articles and is the co-author of the Sadlier vocabulary program, Vocabulary for Success. Nancy, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to all of you as well. I'm a high school teacher, and I have what I'm actually doing is calling from my school right now. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'm calling from my high school right now. We're just finishing up lunch, so I'm going to apologize in advance if a student bursts in or if you hear some traffic outside as well. I've been working with complex text, as I know that you have as well. And one of the interesting things that I'm really finding in working with my students is the pushback that I'm getting from some surprising places. You know, I was really committed to and remain committed to ramping up the kinds of complex texts that my students use on a regular basis. And I anticipated that where I would get the most resistance were from the students who we would probably identify traditionally as being struggling readers. What's been interesting to me is that that is not where I've gotten the pushback. I have actually found that my students who would be conventionally identified as being very strong readers, reading on or above grade level, as being the ones that are often the most resistive to do it. And it's taken me a while to kind of figure out what it is that, that they don't like about having to read complex text. And what I'm realizing, what's dawning on me, is that while they've got some really good reading skills, what they have not developed is a real sense of persistence. In other words, they're not accustomed to running into text that challenges them. They're accustomed to being able to read things through usually one time, understanding it, and then moving on to the next piece of text. And I'm recognizing that my use of those text-dependent questions is beginning to build a habit for some of those stronger readers in sticking with a piece of text and digging down through it. I think as I reflect on those experiences, that my students who are traditionally identified as struggling readers actually know a lot more about what it feels like and what to do when you struggle. It's the kids that have not had a lot of struggle, a lot of experience with that struggle, that are having a more difficult time with doing it. And those text-dependent questions, I'm finding, are a way to be able to ensure that my stronger readers, as well as the readers who need more support, stick with a piece of text and learn that you have to reread more complex text in order to understand how that text unfolds. I'm wondering if any of you have found those experiences as well with your own students. In terms of text-dependent questions, which has certainly gained a lot of attention with people paying more attention to what it really means, it really is around three ideas. The purpose of those text-dependent questions is really to drive students back into the text, to pose questions to them that cause them to have to reread. As a 10th grade teacher, I can tell you that what's not successful, what I've not found to be successful, is in telling my students, well, read it again, and read it again, and read it again. In other words, I need to give them purpose for why it is that they should read again. And those text-dependent questions are creating that purpose. What I want them to be able to do is I want them to be able to extract evidence from the text. Certainly it's all over the Common Core standards that finding evidence and using evidence to support your claims is central to what it is that students should be doing. So I need to craft some of my questions to be able to help them locate evidence. I also need them to make inferences. And I think this is the place where, for some of my stronger readers, that they've actually had more difficulty. They're used to skimming along the surface of a reading and understanding at a basic comprehension level what's going on. They certainly can decode all of the words, and they can follow the plot line and those sorts of things. But they're not as experienced with digging down deeper to be able to understand the underlying meaning that happens in the text. So some of my text-dependent questions need to cause them to do that, to be able to infer. And then the third purpose that that I have in crafting those text-dependent questions is that I want to help them draw conclusions. This is especially important when we're talking about informational text of any kind. In some informational texts, certainly the author is drawing the conclusion for you. But in those more complex pieces of text, informational and otherwise, the author leaves it to the reader to draw conclusions. And so again, if I'm confronted with that kind of reading, then I know that some of my questions need to cause them to draw those conclusions. So as I said, text-dependent questions, the purpose of them is to get them to reread, but to reread with purpose, not simply to read again and again and again, but to actually go after the kind of information that I need for them to go after. I'll give you an example and a non-example of a text-dependent question. And I'm going to go ahead and be the first one to admit that I have used questions like this myself. Thinking about 8th graders reading the Declaration of Independence, and specifically the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, a common task that 8th grade students have to do in their U.S. history course. There was a time when I would start with this kind of question. The question number 1 that's on there. If you were present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what would you do? And then we'd be off to the races as the 13-year-olds would tell me what it was that they would do if they were at the Declaration of Independence. And it took me a while to realize that I actually didn't care what it was that they did at the Declaration of Independence. And let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean is that for a 13-year-old student in this century, it is difficult to get that student to think beyond his or her own experiences. In fact, if you look at the research by people like Sam Weinberg, specifically around history, what they have found is that when you pose questions like the first one to students, they simply transfer their own personal experiences and beliefs and project it onto a historical figure and then justify all of that. It took me a while to realize that the second question was actually much more substantial. And the second question reads, what are the reasons listed in the preamble for supporting their argument to separate from Great Britain? And, you know, the Declaration of Independence has been called by some as being the greatest breakup letter ever. That it really was laying out an argument for why it was that there should be this separation. I want my students to understand that this was carefully thought out and that the people who signed that declaration risked their livelihood, sometimes their lives or their families' lives, in order to be able to sign that. Once they're grounded, once students are really grounded in that kind of thinking, question number 1 and their responses becomes much more interesting, because now they're no longer projecting what it's like to be a 13-year-old in the 21st century. Now they truly are beginning to put themselves back in the shoes of the people who wrote that document to begin with. So it's not that question number 1 could never be answered, but what I've learned is that I need to hold back on the first type of question until I've really built a strong foundation through questions that are more similar to the second one. If you look at the preamble, by the way, for the U.S. history buffs that are out there, there are about 27 different reasons why they listed why they wanted to separate from Great Britain. Regarding that as well, regarding that progression of text-dependent questions, another thing that I've become more focused on is in understanding that the kinds of questions that I ask can help to lead their thinking along the way. That I'm not just asking questions in a willy-nilly kind of fashion, but rather that I'm building for them layer by layer a deeper understanding of what that text is all about. And part of it, I'll talk about both sides of this, but right now I'd like you to pay attention to the left side of your screen. Moving from part to whole. This idea of asking questions that center at first on word and sentence level, and over time ask them to look across the document at larger questions along the way. That's an important part of my progression. I'll talk about on the right side of the screen what that actually looks like in a lesson, but right now I'd like for you to hang out with the idea that we move from part to whole in terms of looking at a document or looking at a reading. I'm going to give you a document right here, and I'm going to give you, 2 or 3 minutes to be able to read through it. And I'll stop talking so that you're able to do that. However, just to contextualize this was the message that General Eisenhower wrote to his troops on the morning of June 6th, encouraging them as they were getting ready to embark on the D-Day invasion. So I'll pause for about 2 minutes and let you read through this. I chose this reading because it's short and would actually fit onto one PowerPoint slide. And also, too, because I'm assuming that you've got a fair amount of background knowledge with this piece of text. Even if you don't know the wording exactly, you understand the purpose of it. You probably got a sense of what Eisenhower's purpose was in doing that. And so I wanted to talk a bit about that progression of questions. It would be easy, quite frankly, to be able to have students read this once and then start a discussion that would take them further and further away from the text. But that's not what I want to do. This really is a complex piece of text, and it's not because of the decoding skills that are involved, but it's understanding what the message was and why the author, General Eisenhower, may have written this particular letter. So I'll show you an example of a couple of different kinds of text-dependent questions. I want to talk with them about how it is that words or phrases are used in this particular document. And if you look at the anchor standards, Standard 4 really speaks to all of this, about analyzing word choices and how that shapes the tone of the document. So here's a question for them that's a text-dependent question. I can say to them, what words and phrases does General Eisenhower use to inspire the troops on D-Day? That question causes them to have to go back into the reading. Even though, and I'm going to stay on this screen for a moment, even though you've read this document, even though you have a fair amount of background knowledge to understand what the purpose of this was, you can't answer that question unless you go back to look in the text. So if I go back to look at the text for just a moment, which I may or may not be able to do, what I can do is I can find those inspirational words that he uses along the way. I'm trying to advance my slide. There we go. So here's a second question now that I'm going to pose to them. And this is now at the paragraph level. Although that was really just a long document, I want you to think about paragraphs not in terms of indentation, but really more as representing important segments that happen within that message. And again, looking at the anchor standards that this speaks to, certainly Standard 2 about summarizing what those key details are, as well as investigating the structure of what's used, are important skills for them to be able to understand this document. So for instance, I can ask them questions like how his message to the troops acknowledged the difficulty of the mission but assures them that they will be triumphant. In what ways does he accomplish this? That was a real balancing act that Eisenhower had to do. He had to exhort the troops. He had to encourage them. He had to inspire them and make sure that his message to them was full of confidence. But in the same regard, it would have been deemed as being unrealistic by those troops if he didn't, as a general, also acknowledge that this was going to be a difficult day for all of them. And that's a really, that's a careful balance that a writer has to use when there are really two messages that are happening along there. And Eisenhower did this beautifully. So again, we go back into the reading and we look for those phrases, those really key details that help us to understand the balance that Eisenhower had to use to be able to craft this. I can also ask about how it was that Eisenhower used religious imagery and how that contrasted with how he used it in the opening and then in the closing as well. If we go back to the reading for just a moment, I'll show you what I mean. So looking at the religious imagery that he used, in the beginning, he talks about the Crusades and makes a real connection to all of that. Do you see all the background knowledge that you need in order to be able to have that? And he uses words like a march. He uses the brothers in arms imagery that's associated with going to war, but going to war with a moral charge that is felt by the soldiers to be able to do that. I'll draw your attention now to the end of the document. At the end of the document, he's dropped away those kinds of religious imagery. It's not about a militant struggle. It's now about, as he said, beseeching the blessing of Almighty God, asking for protection, asking for a blessing. That's a very different set of religious images than he used at the beginning. Eisenhower accomplished a lot in these few sentences, and it's worthwhile for our students to be able to take a close look at that in the context of their study in U.S. history about how this happened. I'll just make a note of the way that I use this, and the U.S. history teacher at my school used this. When we do a close reading of this, and we spend a class period talking about this document, they gain a real understanding of what Eisenhower intended. But then the following day, we give them a second document. And the second document is one that is much less well known, and it is the other message that Eisenhower crafted in case they were defeated at Normandy. And fortunately, he didn't need to use that. But it's in the presidential archives, and it's interesting when you look at the date and when we have students look at the date to understand that Eisenhower wrote these two messages on the same date, one that he sent to the troops and then one that he had prepared in case it was not successful. And now we begin to understand and have discussions about what it means to be a leader and to understand and accept responsibility for the risks and the possible defeats that might happen. That's an example of some close reading. It's more than just skimming along the surface and understanding what the main points were along the way. And those text-dependent questions help to drive them to understand those deeper levels. Now I'll talk about the second side of that diagram there. And this is a way that for me has been helpful in being able to prepare the kinds of questions that I want to use. And when I'm doing a close reading, I can tell you I write out these questions. It doesn't mean that I'm not asking any other questions, but I know that these questions are the ones where the real teaching points are. These are the questions that when students begin to be able to answer them and begin to find the answers in those documents, that I see the light bulbs go off over their heads. So I'll use this within a context of a lesson that I taught not all that long ago. And that was in using a piece of poetry. And I'll show you that poem in just a moment. But I also wanted to talk about how it was that the 11th grade English teacher, Brian, and I used this in our classes. So we talked at first with our students about establishing the purpose of what it was that we wanted them to gain for this. And the purpose was really about thinking about memories, about the role of memory and whether memory changes or not with the passage of time. So we're kind of setting the stage for them in giving them a big question to have to think about. We actually have returned to this question a couple of different times to look at other pieces of literature as well. Again, in establishing the purpose, we also wanted them to understand that in this poem that there's a relationship between the form of the poem and the content of the poem that's there. And the poem is My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Redke, which is a well-known piece of poetry, but it's also understanding that a lot of our students don't exactly know what a waltz was. So we spend a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but we spend a little bit of time. We show them this image. This is an image from Renoir, and we chose this image in particular because we wanted them to understand that a waltz at the time as a contemporary dance was a peasant dance. It wasn't, you know, when they watch Dancing with the Stars and they see all the people with their very fancy outfits on. We wanted them to understand that this was a dance of the people. This was something that everybody did. It wasn't that you had to wear a tuxedo in order to be able to do it. I also I have on there as a link, but I won't play it. It's just a small sound file so that they begin to hear the unique beat of a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I played that for them as well. That becomes really important because the poem itself follows a similar meter. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'll give you a minute or two to read through this poem to refresh your memory about this poem, and then I'll talk about the kinds of questions that Brian and I used with our students. Now, many of you recognize that poem. As I said, it's one of the more common poems that usually appears in high school anthologies and sometimes even middle school anthologies. The links that I have there are links to, again, the sound file of the waltz itself, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the top link is to Theodore Redke actually reading this poem himself. When I did this with my students, I had them first read the poem silently to themselves. Then I had them listen to Redke reading the poem, and I played the meter underneath his reading so that they could hear the pacing and the rhythm of the poem again. What's happened at this point is that I've now had students minimally read this poem through at least twice before we've ever even gotten into it. Notice as well that I didn't front load what this poem was about. I want them to discover what this poem is about. The only front-loading I did, if you will, and it really wasn't even front-loading, was just ensuring that there was some background knowledge, that they knew what a waltz was, that they understood that it was a dance, and that it was a dance that common people used. It wasn't a fancy dance. And I wanted them to understand the unique meter that's used in the waltz, and that that's similar to the meter that's used in the poem. So now I start to ask some questions of them. And again, they've got the poem there in front of them. And when I do this, I make a photocopy of it, and I encourage them to write all over that text. I want them to do all of that. Yes, it's true, the photocopy bill goes up a little bit at my school because I'm making photocopies of things like this, but it's well worth it. So the first questions I ask are those general understanding questions. Again, thinking about how it is that I'm going to deepen their knowledge. What I want them to get to in this particular case is just what the overall story is that's going on in this poem. Depending on whether I'm using a piece of informational text, I'm using a piece of persuasive text, I may be asking different types of questions, like the main claim or something like that. But in this case, it's really just the overall view of the poem itself. What's the basic story? And so my question that I pose to them is, what's the story of this poem and what images does it create? And so that became our first conversation. Now, I'm gonna share a caution with this. I have lots of students who want to immediately answer this question because they know the answer. And my job is to encourage them to go back into the text. So when they say to me, you know, this is a story about a father coming home from work and dancing around the kitchen with his little boy and then taking him off to bed, that I need to follow up with questions that say, where did you find that? Show us what it is that you mean. So especially when I'm doing these general understanding questions, I need to redirect them back into the reading again. After we've had some, and as you can imagine in this poem, it's a rather short discussion. It's pretty straightforward in terms of what the story's about. Now I'm going to ask them to start looking for those key details, especially searching, in this particular case, searching for the nuances of the meanings that are in there. It's looking for those supporting details that are critical to the main idea of this poem. In a piece of informational text, there might be questions that are around the who, what, when, where, why, how much, how many kinds of questions that we may pose. So my key detail questions are in asking the students to consider whose memory this is and how old we think the narrator is. And again, my job is to follow up when they answer with asking them, where did you find that? Or tell us the phrase or the stanza that helped you to understand all of that. Now, not surprisingly, students can key in, especially on the fact that the poet uses the term that he's a small boy, that his right ear scraped a buckle. So we talk about how tall a person would be if they were right about the belt buckle, so probably about 5 or 6 years old. And they also note, too, that the tone of this, especially the fact that it's written in past tense, seems to suggest that this is something that happened a long time ago and that he's probably now an adult. There's some speculation that goes along with that, and that's okay. I encourage that kind of speculation, but be able to support your claim with the evidence from the text. So those general understanding questions and those key detail questions tend to be more literal in nature. We also ask questions, for example, like, well, why is the mother angry? Because we certainly get that sense from the poem as well. And students will talk about the fact that, you know, she's been cleaning up. They're speculating again. She's been cleaning up after dinner, and now he's making a mess of the kitchen. Some students focus in on the fact that if his hands are dirty, then probably his shoes are dirty and his clothes are dirty, and mom's not too happy about these kinds of things. These are all at the literal level. But what I want to do is I want to be able to bridge their understanding from a literal level meaning of the text to a more inferential level of text. And poetry, of course, is a great place for this to happen. In order to be able to do that, I ask them questions about the vocabulary, and I ask them questions about the text structure. The vocabulary and the text structure really do bridge those literal and inferential meanings, because in vocabulary we move from denotation, what's the actual meaning of the word, to connotation. Perhaps it has to do with tone or mood, but what kinds of feelings does that cause us to understand? In the case of poetry, we may be talking about figurative language. In an informational piece, we may be talking about shades of meaning. Why did the author pick this word and not that word to forward her message? And in some cases, again, depending on the type of text that you're using, there may be some organizational structures that help you to understand the meaning of the text. This particular poem is a great example of how the organization helps you to understand the meaning, because keep in mind what the meter of the poem is. So here's a vocabulary question. What does countenance mean? That's, you know, something that is usually unfamiliar terminology to most students. It's one of the few words in here that they wouldn't understand. And but more importantly is the second question: what other word in the poem tells you what it means? So it's not just a matter of being able to furnish the definition. I need you to go back in the poem and find out how the poet makes sure that you understand what the word countenance means. And in this particular case, countenance has to do with face, with your face, but the poet uses a made-up word, unfrown, that helps us to understand what countenance means. We know the mother's angry. He refers to the word countenance along with the word unfrown, and that helps us to understand what it is that he's talking about. We go back to the idea of meter, because as I said, the structure of this poem helps them to understand what's going on. And this is a time when I can do a bit of teaching about Ambach Trimeter and being able to hear that sound of the waltz, which they now understand because they've heard it a couple of times, and they're now beginning to read it in their own mind with that same rhythm in mind. I'm trying to deepen their understanding of what seems to be an otherwise fairly simple and straightforward piece of poetry by asking them about the author's purpose. Now, author's purpose questions can involve a couple of different possible aspects. I might be, at a given time, asking them a question about genre. What's the purpose of this? Is it to entertain? Is it to persuade? And so on. At other times, I may be asking them questions about point of view. When we read short stories by Edgar Allan Poe, we have to talk about point of view and the idea of the unreliable narrator, because Poe invented that device. So we need to look for that unreliable narrator. I'm only using that as an example. There are other pieces of text where I really want to tune into the critical literacy. For example, whose story is not being represented. These are all just examples, general examples of those types of questions. I'll go back to the poem, and here are the questions that I posed to my students. In what ways are hands important, and how does this give you insight into the poet's purpose? So again, we go back into that piece of text and we look for his use of imagery regarding hands and paying attention to why it is that the poet keeps talking about hands. And there are a couple of different places where we find that. In line 9, that the hand held my wrist. So, and we talk about how small a person's wrist needs to be for a hand to be able to encircle it. In line 10, the father's hand is being described as being battered on one knuckle. And then in lines 13 and 14, and I have to tell you, here's the most controversial part of this poem. The poet says, "You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt." And that's where I want my students to get to. That's the point that I'm leading to, is them paying attention to those particular lines in the poem. We talk about, for example, why, and again, this is on author's purpose, why he called this my papa's waltz rather than a waltz with my papa. And we talk about the issue of control and who's in control of that particular dance. Papa is in control of this dance. Students will, at this point, start speculating about whether the child was willing or unwilling to engage in this dance. And that usually sparks quite a bit of conversation. And again, as I said, this is a relatively, seemingly straightforward piece of poetry that, because of the questions, starts to lead them to consider other meanings along the way. Now I'm getting at the level of inference. And again, the type of text is what really points me in the direction of the kind of question I'm going to ask. If it's a persuasive piece of text, I'm going to ask questions about the arguments that are forwarded. If it's an informational piece of text, I'm going to return to those key details, but observe how it is that they build over the whole piece of text, and not just at the word level or sentence level. We talk again about what the waltz represents in this poem. And I have to tell you that if I start with this kind of question, I don't get the depth of reply that I do after we've built this solid foundation of understanding the literal meaning of the text before we begin moving into the inferential meaning of the text. Finally, we finish up with questions that might have to do with opinions or arguments or connections to other pieces of text that they've read as well. And this is where discussion really starts. Is this a fond memory, or is it one of abuse, and what's your evidence? I find this to be almost something that is generational in nature. Most adults that I know, people that are of my age group, regard this as a fond memory. Dancing with Dad around the kitchen, Mom's not too happy about it, and he waltzes him off to bed to put him to bed. But I find among my students that a growing number of them think of this as one of abuse. And while I don't agree with that perspective, what I really want them to be able to do is to justify it with evidence. It's okay with me if they don't share the same opinion that I share. In fact, that's the beauty of a complex piece of text, is that there are possibilities in some pieces of text to come away with it from more than one perspective. What's your evidence of all of that? In thinking about developing text-dependent questions, whether you're using a piece of poetry, you're using a historical document, or you're using anything else, these are questions that I find are helpful to me in being able to design all of those. So I always have to ask myself the question, am I writing questions, am I creating questions that require the reader to return to the text? As I said, they're not the only questions that I ask, but these are my tent poles. These are the high points that I want to hit in order to be able to deepen their understanding of that piece of text. A second question that I use as kind of a quality control or a gut check is to ask myself, do the questions require the reader to use evidence to support his or her claim? As I said, there are times when those kinds of questions are my follow-up questions. How do you know that? Or show us where you found that. I also want to look at whether there's a progression in that knowledge. Are we moving from text explicit to text implicit knowledge? And then finally, are there questions that I'm asking them that ask them to analyze or evaluate or create? That last question, ask them to evaluate. Do you think this is a fond memory, or do you think this is one of abuse? And we return back to that overarching question about whether memory changes with time. certainly in my class, and I imagine in your classes too, you have students who have a variety of diverse needs that also need to be supported. I'm here in San Diego. I'm about 15 miles away from the border, and it's important that I acknowledge and work with the fact that many of my students are English learners. I have students with disabilities. We are an inclusive school, so all of our students with IEPs are in our classes as well. And so I also have to think about what their accommodations are that I can offer to them, because I certainly don't want them to not be exposed to complex text simply because they need some more supports. And so as it applies especially to text-dependent questions, it's easy enough, because I've prepared the questions, to give them those text-dependent questions in advance of the reading. There are times when I may do a little bit of pre-teaching with a smaller group. I spend 10 or 15 minutes with that group and do a little bit of the pre-teaching. Sometimes I have to spend a little bit more time with certain students on building their background knowledge or using cognates, especially for students whose primary language is something other than English. There are times when I may be providing realia for them or some visual glossaries. Sometimes it's just imagery. You know, as you can see from this presentation, I think those visual images are really important. It's easy enough for me to be able to put a visual image up there to be able to support our discussion. Again, depending on, maybe it's a piece of informational text or a piece of persuasive text, I can highlight for them in advance what some of those contextual clues are. What I don't want to do, however, is I don't want to over-teach what it is that I have to offer, and I also want to make sure that for students with disabilities and students who are English learners in my classroom, that they also get the opportunity to appropriately struggle. It's okay that students struggle at times with a reading. In fact, I'd like to offer that, in my opinion, we need to start changing our language, and we ought to be able to say that there are times when every reader in our class is a struggling reader. But remember that a struggling reader doesn't mean a reader who is ignored or a reader who's just put into a corner and said, good luck to you. Rather, I want to make sure that I'm putting in front of all of my students texts that at times challenge their thinking, challenge their skills, and that at the same time that I'm scaffolding their understanding along the way. My text-dependent questions are scaffolds because we move from a strong foundation at the literal level to help them get to that inferential thinking that they need to be able to do. So with that, I'm gonna pause on that, and wondering if you have questions or things that you're thinking about with using text-dependent questions. So Laura, I'll turn this back to you.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. How informative. I learned so much, and every time I listen to you, I learn more and more.
Thank you.
This is such an important topic, as you have explained, and have explained very clearly. Thank you. We have 2 questions right now in the queue, so I would like to invite everyone on the line, if you do have a question or you want further clarity about something that Dr. Frey has introduced, please go ahead and write it in the question box on the right-hand side in your control panel. Nancy, I have 2 questions here. The first is, what are some tips for developing text-dependent questions?
You know, what I have come to understand in my own practice is that if I'm going to develop text-dependent questions, that I actually have to engage in a close reading myself. I have become accustomed over the years to being able to pick up a piece of text, read it through pretty quickly, much like my strong readers that I have in class, and then move on from there. Yeah, I know what it's about. I got the gist of it. I'm fine, and I know how to lead a discussion. Using text-dependent questions has forced me to engage in the kind of close reading that I want my students to be able to do. One of the things that I found is that sometimes when I go into a piece of text and I'm trying to figure out what those text-dependent questions should be, I don't actually know what my teaching point is. And it is revealed to me through the process of developing those questions. And again, that's been a shift for me because I have been in the practice of knowing what my purpose is. I know what my teaching point is. I know the piece of text that I'm going to match up with it, and then ready, get, set, go. And now I understand that I don't always know going into a piece of text what my teaching point is going to be, that at times I begin to understand the more complex levels of that text through the process of developing the questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. As teachers, we're very flexible all the time, and your point is well taken. Here's one more question. What do you find to be the most challenging in developing or using text-dependent questions?
I'll talk about the use of them in particular. I have not found that students are always accustomed to us asking these kinds of questions. I work at the high school level, so I've got kids that have been in school for 10 or 11 years. And they have gotten used to, they've gotten very accustomed to us asking superficial comprehension questions. And some of the questions that I pose to them, they don't have an immediate answer to. And I've had to learn not to answer the question for them too rapidly because I need to fill the silence. In other words, I've had to learn to kind of couch my own behaviors, to let them struggle and probe and be confused for a bit. And that's been a hard thing for me to be able to do because we're very used to, 6 kids in the class that can answer all the questions, and we call on them, and we feel good about ourselves at the end of the day because kids answered our questions. And that's been a real challenge for me, is in thinking about my teaching as being that my teaching needs to provoke in all of them some errors and some struggle, and that's okay. That my job is not to only ask them questions that I think they already have the answer to. The other I don't know if the word is difficulty, but the other challenge that I've had is in fostering the kinds of discussion that need to happen in class. At the beginning of the year, I mean, now here we're in November and it's much more comfortable at this point, but at the beginning of the year, they wanted to only answer questions to me and not talk across the room to one another. They're very comfortable with talking in small groups. They are less comfortable in talking in large groups. And it's been, I've had to be persistent with them in trying to learn how to discuss as opposed to simply answering my questions, and to look at these questions as discussion starters and not necessarily just simply supplying the answer and then we move on from there. And it took a little while for them to get comfortable with being able to do that. And honestly, to be wrong or to disagree with somebody else in the room.
Yes, very healthy. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your vision. We've all learned so much from you and always do. Thank you for being part of Sadlier's fall webinar series. I know that you're going to do another one on close reading in a few weeks, and we will make sure that everyone on this webinar, the participants, will receive an invitation that they can share with their colleagues. So, Nancy, once again, thank you very much, and to all that have attended, thank you so much for your support, and if you are going to NCTE, we will see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.